Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ali, your host for today's mystery. We're joining Poirot and Captain Hastings today in the atmospheric Yorkshire countryside where ancient towers hold deadly secrets and ghostly legends mask very human crimes. Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from today. Let me know in the comments if you like the story. Please hit the like button. Your unwavering support means the world to me. Now, settle in with a warm cup of Yorkshire tea and let's uncover this mystery together. Chapter 1. The Summons from Yorkshire. The Murder of Crispin Grimsby. Chapter 1. The Summons from Yorkshire. It was on a grey Tuesday morning in late October that the telegram arrived, which was to plunge my friend Hercule and myself into one of the most baffling cases of our long association. I had been enjoying a leisurely breakfast in our comfortable flat in Whitehaven Mansions when George Poirot's immaculate valet knocked and entered with the familiar yellow envelope. "A telegram has arrived for you, sir," George announced in his quiet, deferential manner, setting down the silver salver beside Poirot's precisely arranged morning correspondence. Poirot, who had been methodically consuming his morning chocolate and croissants with his usual fastidious attention to detail, raised his eyebrows slightly. He dabbed his magnificent mustaches with his napkin before picking up the telegram with those small, well-manicured fingers of his. "Tiens," he murmured, scanning the message. "Most interesting, Hastings. We have here a summons from Yorkshire." Yorkshire. I set down my coffee cup with perhaps more force than necessary. Rather a dreary time of year for a jaunt to the north, don't you think? "Indeed, mon ami, but listen to this." He cleared his throat and read aloud. "Urgent. Brother murdered in Bloody Tower. Police baffled by supernatural circumstances. Require your immediate assistance. Nigel Grimsby, Grimswood Grange, Yorkshire." I nearly choked on my toast. Supernatural circumstances. I say, Poirot, surely you don't intend to involve yourself with ghost stories and whatnot? My friend's grey eyes held a peculiar gleam as he folded the telegram with precise movements. "Ghosts, Hastings. Hercule Poirot does not believe in the supernatural, but murder. Ah, that is always most natural, most human. And where there is murder, there are always the little grey cells that can resolve the mystery. But this fellow mentioned supernatural circumstances specifically." I protested. "Sounds like a lot of nonsense to me." "Precisement, my friend. And that is what makes it so very interesting. When someone wishes Poirot to believe in ghosts, it is because they have something very real indeed to hide." Despite my reservations about chasing phantoms across the Yorkshire moors, I found myself that very afternoon seated beside Poirot in a first-class railway carriage, watching the London suburbs give way to increasingly bleak countryside. The October sky hung heavy and grey above us, and by the time we reached our destination, a thin drizzle had begun to fall. Grimswood Grange stood like something from a Gothic romance, its ancient stones dark with moisture and age. The main house, built in the Tudor style, sprawled across well-tended grounds, but it was the medieval tower that dominated the landscape. Rising from a slight hill perhaps 100 yards from the main building, the circular stone tower seemed to brood over the estate with an almost malevolent presence. "Good Lord," I muttered, gathering my coat about me as we alighted from the motorcar that had collected us from the station. "Rather gives one the shivers, doesn't it?" Poirot surveyed the scene with those sharp eyes of his, taking in every detail of the imposing structure before us. "Most atmospheric, certainly. But observe, Hastings, the windows. They are well maintained, the grounds. They are cared for. This is not the home of paupers, whatever financial difficulties our Mr. Nigel Grimsby may possess." Before I could ask how he had deduced financial troubles from a telegram, the heavy oak door of the main house swung open, and a man emerged to greet us. Nigel Grimsby was perhaps in his early 30s, tall and well-dressed in country tweeds, but there was an unmistakable nervousness about his manner. His dark hair was perfectly groomed, yet his hands trembled slightly as he approached, and his smile seemed forced. "Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings, thank heaven you've come so quickly." His voice carried the cultured tones of good breeding, but underneath lay an unmistakable note of strain. I confess I hardly knew where to turn. The local police are completely at sea, and the circumstances are so extraordinary. "Mr. Grimsby," Poirot inclined his head formally, "permit me to express my condolences on the loss of your brother. You have my assurance that Hercule Poirot will do everything possible to discover the truth." "Truth," Nigel repeated with a bitter laugh. I'm no longer certain what that word means. Come, you must see the tower where it happened. But first, perhaps you'd care for some refreshment. The journey from London is a long one. As we followed him into the house, I couldn't help but notice the quality of the furnishings, clearly valuable antiques, but bearing that slightly worn appearance that suggested a family maintaining appearances despite strained circumstances. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors gazed down from panelled walls, and everywhere there was evidence of a heritage stretching back centuries. Your family has owned this estate for some time, I perceive, Poirot observed, as we were ushered into a comfortable sitting room where a fire crackled welcomingly in an enormous stone fireplace. Since 1487, Nigel replied with evident pride. 20 generations of Grimsbys have called Grimswood Grange home. My brother Crispin was the 21st. His voice caught slightly on the correction. And the tower where this tragedy occurred, the Bloody Tower, we've always called it, built in the 14th century as part of the original fortifications. It has a rather grim history, I'm afraid, several deaths over the centuries, including that of Lady Constance Grimsby in 1598. Since then, there have been ... sightings. I saw Poirot's moustaches twitch slightly, though whether with amusement or interest. I could not say sightings of what nature, monsieur. Nigel glanced toward the mullioned windows, where the ancient tower loomed dark against the grey sky. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. The Grey Lady, Mr. Poirot, they say, she walks the battlements when tragedy is about to befall our family, ... And 3 nights ago, she was seen again. The fire seemed to dim as he spoke, and I found myself drawing my chair closer to its warmth. Chapter 2. The Household at Grimswood Grange. Chapter 2. The Household at Grimswood Grange. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, the Yorkshire air sharp with the promise of winter. I found Poirot already dressed and examining a detailed plan of the estate grounds with his customary methodical attention. He had spread the aged parchment across the breakfast table, anchoring its corners with the salt cellar and sugar bowl with typical precision. "Ah, Hastings, you are awake at last," he observed, without looking up. "Regard this planet as most instructive. The tower, she stands quite separate from the main house, connected only by this gravelled path, most isolated. Nest cepa. Rather, I agreed, helping myself to kippers from the sideboard. "I say, Poirot, shouldn't we be examining the scene of the crime first thing?" "Patience, my friend. First, Poirot must understand the people. The tower, she will wait. She has waited already for many centuries. But the people, they change their stories. They forget the important details. They convince themselves of what they wish to believe. Today we meet the household." Nigel Grimsby appeared punctually at 9 o'clock, looking somewhat more composed than the previous evening, though I noticed his hands still betrayed a slight tremor when he lit his morning cigarette. "I've arranged for you to meet everyone this morning," he announced. "My sister is in the morning room. Dr. Thorne is in his study as usual, and Jenkins is about his duties. Where would you prefer to begin?" "With the lady of the house, if you please," Poirot replied, carefully folding the estate plan. "It is always most instructive to understand the domestic arrangements." Seraphina Grimsby was indeed a striking woman, though not in the conventional sense I had expected. She possessed an almost ethereal quality that made one think of pre-Raphaelite painting stall and willowy, with auburn hair that caught the morning light streaming through the tall windows of the morning room. Her pale blue dress seemed to float about her as she moved, and there was something in her grey eyes that suggested depths of feeling carefully controlled. "Mr. Poirot," she said, extending a slender hand, "Nigel tells me you've come to help us understand. What happened to poor Crispin? I confess the whole affair has left me quite bewildered." Madame Grimsby. Poirot bowed formally over her hand. "Permit me to express my sympathy for your loss. Your husband, he had been in good health recently." "Oh yes, quite robust for a man of 43. She seated herself gracefully on a silk-covered chair, her movements fluid and precise. Crispin was always careful about his constitution. He took long walks about the estate each evening. Said it cleared his mind for his business affairs. Ah yes, the business affairs. Your husband, he was much occupied with such matters." A shadow passed across her delicate features. "Increasingly so, I'm afraid. These past months he seemed quite preoccupied, always locked away in his study with correspondence and ledgers. I sometimes felt I scarcely knew him any more." I observed Poirot's sharp attention to this revelation, though his expression remained pleasantly neutral. And on the evening of the tragedy, Madam, you were where I took my usual walk in the gardens. After dinner, I'm afraid I find the house rather oppressive in the evenings, so many shadows and memories. The fresh air soothes me." She touched her throat with one pale hand. "I wore my grey showers. The October evenings are quite chill." After taking our leave of the lady, Nigel led us through a maze of corridors to Dr. Silas Thorne's study. The room was a bibliophile's paradise, every wall lined with books from floor to ceiling, ancient volumes bound in cracked leather competing for space with newer academic texts. The air was heavy with the scent of old paper and pipe tobacco. Dr. Thorne himself proved to be a man of perhaps 50, with the slightly stooped shoulders of one who spent his life bent over manuscripts. His grey beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles held the keen intelligence of a scholar. When we entered, he was examining what appeared to be a medieval manuscript with a magnifying glass. "Dr. Thorne," Nigel announced, "these are the gentlemen I mentioned, Mr. Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings." The historian rose with evident enthusiasm, setting aside his work carefully. "Mr. Poirot, what an honor! I've followed your cases with great interest. Such a methodical approach to the mysteries of human behavior." "You are too kind, Doctor. I understand you are the authority on the history of this estate." Indeed. 20 years I've been cataloguing the Grimsby family records, the legends and traditions, fascinating material. The Grey Lady alone has appeared in family accounts dating back to the late 16th century. "Most interesting," Poirot murmured. "And you yourself, Doctor, you have perhaps seen this apparition?" Dr. Thorne's eyes lit up with scholarly excitement. "Not until recently, I must confess. But 3 nights ago, the very night of poor Crispin's death, I witnessed the most extraordinary sight. I was taking my evening constitutional round the grounds, when I observed a grey figure gliding near the tower battlements, quite unmistakable." "Really? You were walking alone at that hour?" "Oh yes, quite my habit. I often take late walks when I'm wrestling with a particularly difficult historical problem. The night air clarifies the mind wonderfully." Our final interview was with Jenkins, whom we discovered polishing silver in the butler's pantry with the mechanical precision of long practice. He was a man of perhaps 60, with the ramrod bearing of an old soldier and the discreet manner of a perfect servant. Yet I detected something in his pale blue eyes, a carefully controlled resentment. Perhaps, or merely the weariness of long service. "Jenkins," Nigel said with apparent discomfort, "Mr. Poirot would like to speak with you about the night Sir Crispin died." "Certainly, Sir." Jenkins's voice was carefully modulated, betraying nothing of his inner thoughts. "I served Sir Crispin his dinner as usual that evening, 8 o'clock precisely. He seemed somewhat agitated. I thought, though he said nothing specific. Agitated in what manner?" Poirot inquired gently. "He kept glancing toward the windows, sir, as if expecting someone. When I brought the second course, he asked if there had been any visitors. I assured him there had been none, but he seemed unconvinced." "And your own movements that evening?" "I retired to my quarters at 9, sir, after ensuring the house was secure. I heard nothing unusual during the night. As we made our way back to our guest rooms, I found myself thoroughly confused by the various accounts. Each member of the household seemed to have perfectly reasonable explanations for their whereabouts, yet something felt distinctly wrong about the whole business." Poirot, however, appeared thoughtful rather than puzzled, his grey eyes holding that peculiar gleam that I had learned to associate with the early stages of his mental processes. He paused at his chamber door, one hand on the polished brass handle. "Most instructive, Hastings. Most instructive indeed. We have here a household where everyone walks alone in the evening, where the master fears unwelcome visitors, and where the dead return to walk the battlements. Tomorrow we shall examine this mysterious tower where impossibilities become possible." Chapter 3. The Bloody Tower's Secret. Chapter 3. The Bloody Tower's Secret. The morning air carried a distinct chill as Poirot and I made our way across the gravel path toward the infamous Bloody Tower. Even in broad daylight, the ancient structure possessed an undeniably sinister aspect, its weathered stones dark with age and moisture from the previous night's frost. The circular tower rose perhaps 60 feet into the grey Yorkshire sky, its medieval battlements creating jagged silhouettes against the low-hanging clouds. "Voila," Poirot murmured, pausing to survey the scene with those sharp grey eyes of his. "Here we have the scene of our impossible crime, Hastings. A locked room in the truest sense, or so it would appear. Dr. Thorne had joined us for this expedition, his scholarly enthusiasm evident as he gestured toward the tower's base. The original construction dates to approximately 1380, he explained, his breath forming small puffs in the cold air. Built as part of the estate's defensive fortifications, though it's been largely decorative for the past 2 centuries. As we approached the heavy oak door, I could see why the local police had been so thoroughly baffled. The entrance was a massive affair, reinforced with iron bands and medieval hinges that looked capable of withstanding a siege. A modern mortise lock had been fitted sometime in the recent past, but the door retained its original iron bar mechanism, a heavy beam that could be lowered into brackets on either side of the frame. Dr. Thorne continued, producing a large brass key from his coat pocket. But when they forced entry, they discovered the inner bar had been lowered as well. Quite impossible to manage from the outside, you see. Poirot examined the lock mechanism with his characteristic attention to detail, his small fingers tracing the metal surfaces with delicate precision. Most interesting, and this key, Doctor Who normally carries it. Sir Crispin kept it, along with keys to all the estate's historical buildings, part of his responsibility as the family head. Precisement, and where was this key found? Still, in Sir Crispin's pocket when the body was discovered. Another confounding element, I'm afraid. As Dr. Thorne unlocked the door, I heard the heavy mechanism turn with a grinding sound that spoke of centuries of use. The door swung open on hinges that protested with a low groan, revealing the tower's dim interior. The space within was circular, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, with stone walls that rose unbroken to the vaulted ceiling some 15 feet above. A narrow stone staircase spiraled upward along the wall, leading to what I presumed were the upper chambers and battlements. Medieval arrow slits provided the only natural light, creating thin shafts of illumination that did little to dispel the gloom. The body was discovered here. Dr. Thorne indicated a spot near the center of the stone floor. Sir Crispin was lying on his back, the dagger protruding from his chest. No signs of struggle. According to the police report, Poirot had already begun his methodical examination, moving slowly around the perimeter of the chamber with that peculiar, precise gait of his. He paused frequently, sometimes kneeling to examine the stone floor with his magnifying glass, other times running his fingers along the ancient walls. "You mentioned the dagger came from the estate's collection, Doctor?" he inquired, without looking up from his inspection. "Indeed, a 15th century piece from our medieval weaponry display. It disappeared from the museum room 3 days before the murder, though we only noticed its absence the following morning." "Most convenient timing," Poirot observed dryly. "And the museum it is secured?" "Oh yes, locked each evening. But all the family members have keys, of course, as do I and Jenkins. We often have visiting scholars who require access." I found myself growing increasingly frustrated as I watched Poirot's painstaking examination. To my eyes, the tower chamber appeared exactly as one would expect: enchant, dusty, and thoroughly forbidding. Yet my friend seemed to discover significance in every shadow and corner. "Hastings," he called suddenly, "observe this area near the wall. What do you see?" I approached the spot he indicated, a section of floor near the base of the staircase. To my eyes, it looked like the rest of the chamber. Stone flags worn smooth by centuries of use, covered with a fine layer of dust. Nothing particularly unusual, I'm afraid, I admitted. "Maze, Nan, my friend. Look more carefully here. You'll see these slight marks in the dust, and there these scratches on the stone itself." Despite his guidance, the signs remained largely invisible to me. Dr. Thorne, however, leaned in with scholarly interest. "Fascinating," he murmured. "I've spent countless hours in this tower over the years, cataloguing the various historical inscriptions and architectural details. I don't recall noticing those particular markings." "Ah, but when did you last examine this section closely, Doctor?" "Why, not for several months at least. My recent research has focused on the upper chambers and their connection to the Grey Lady legend." Poirot continued his circuit of the chamber, paying particular attention to the base of the walls and the junction where floor met stone. At one point, he spent nearly 10 minutes examining what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary section of medieval masonry. "The construction methods of this period," Dr. Thorne explained as we watched Poirot work, "were quite sophisticated. These walls are nearly 4 feet thick, designed to withstand both siege weapons and the elements. The builders often incorporated hidden spaces and passages for various purposes." "Hidden passages," I exclaimed. "You mean there might be another way in or out?" "Oh, quite possibly. Many medieval towers included such features as escape routes, storage areas, that sort of thing, though I've never discovered any evidence of them in this particular structure." Pooh had moved to the narrow windows, testing each one with gentle pressure. The openings were barely wide enough for a cat to pass through, and set some 8 feet above the floor level. Even if they had been larger, the drop to the ground outside was considerable. "These windows," he mused, "they have never been enlarged or modified. Not to my knowledge. They remain exactly as built, typical arrow slits of the period, designed for defense rather than comfort." After nearly an hour of examination, Poirot finally straightened and brushed dust from his perfectly pressed trousers. His expression held that thoughtful quality I had learned to associate with significant discoveries, though he shared none of his conclusions with us. "Most instructive," he announced. "This tower, she holds many secrets, but not all of them concern the supernatural." I think Dr. Thorne's eyes lit up with scholarly curiosity. "You've discovered something about the Grey Lady legend." "Perhaps, Doctor, perhaps. But first, Poirot must consider what the physical evidence reveals. The stones, they do not lie, as people sometimes do. They record faithfully what has passed." As we made our way back toward the main house, I found myself thoroughly perplexed by the entire business. The locked room puzzle seemed genuinely impossible. Yet Poirot's manner suggested he had detected something significant during our examination. The autumn wind picked up as we crossed the grounds, sending dead leaves skittering across the path before us. Behind us, the bloody tower stood silhouetted against the grey sky, keeping its ancient secrets as it had for centuries past. Chapter 4. The Night of Shadows. Chapter 4. The Night of Shadows. The afternoon following our examination of the bloody tower found Poirot in his most methodical mood. He had arranged for individual interviews with each member of the household, determined to reconstruct with precision the events of that fatal evening. I confess I found his systematic approach somewhat tedious, but long experience had taught me to trust in the workings of those celebrated little grey cells. "Voyons, Hastings," he explained as we settled ourselves in the library for our first interview. "The murder, it did not happen in isolation. It was the culmination of a sequence of events, each one significant in its own way. We must understand not merely what occurred, but when and in what order." Mrs. Seraphina Grimsby was our first subject, and she entered the library with that same ethereal grace I had observed the previous day. She wore a dress of deep blue wool that complemented her auburn hair, and I noticed she moved with the unconscious poise of someone accustomed to being admired. Mrs. Grimsby, Poirot began with his customary formal courtesy. "I must ask you to cast your mind back to 3 evenings ago. Can you recall the details of that night with precision?" "I shall try, Mr. Poirot, though I confess the whole affair seems rather dreamlike now." She seated herself carefully, arranging her skirts with practiced elegance. Dinner was served at the usual time, 8 o'clock. Crispin seemed rather preoccupied, I thought, though he said little during the meal. "Preoccupied in what manner, madam?" He kept glancing toward the windows, as if expecting someone. When Jenkins brought the port, Crispin asked if there had been any messages or visitors. I found it rather odd, as we rarely receive callers in the evening, and after dinner. Crispin retired to his study, as was his custom. I remained in the drawing-room for perhaps half an hour, then decided to take my evening walk. The house can feel rather oppressive at night, with all its shadows and memories. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharp with interest. "Your walk, madame, can you describe it in detail?" "I always follow the same route through the rose garden, along the ornamental lake, then back by way of the herb garden. It takes approximately 45 minutes. She paused, touching her throat with one pale hand. I wore my grey shawl as the evening had turned quite chill. It's cashmere from Scotland, a wedding gift from Crispin's aunt. I noticed Poirot's eyebrows rise almost imperceptibly at this detail, though his expression remained pleasantly neutral. "This grey shawlet is a favourite of yours?" "Oh yes, I wear it frequently for my evening walks. The colour suits me, I think, and the material is wonderfully warm against the Yorkshire air." "And during your walk, did you observe anything unusual, perhaps near the tower?" Seraphina's composure faltered slightly. I did notice something strange as I passed the tower grounds. A greyish figure seemed to be moving near the battlements. At first I thought it might be mist, but the shape was too defined, too purposeful. It gave me quite a turn, I must confess. At what time would this have been? Perhaps 9:30 or a few minutes after. I hurried back to the house immediately. The sight quite unnerved me. After Mrs. Grimsby's departure, Nigel joined us, looking considerably more haggard than when we had first met him. His hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, and I observed that his usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain. Nigel Poirot said gently, "You understand that we must discuss the evening of your brother's death. It is painful, I know, but necessary, of course." Nigel's voice was steady, though I detected an underlying tension. I spent the evening in the estate office working through some business correspondence. Crispin had asked me to review certain documents regarding our financial situation. These documents, they concerned what matters specifically. A flush crept up Nigel's neck. Various investments, property matters, that sort of thing. Crispin was always very thorough about estate business. His hands shook more noticeably as he spoke. "You worked alone in the office?" "Yes, until approximately 10 o'clock. Then I retired to my room with a book." He paused, seeming to struggle with some internal decision. I should mention that Crispin had been concerned about certain business pressures recently. He felt we might need to make some difficult decisions about the estate's future. Poirot's attention sharpened. "What sort of decisions, monsieur?" "Nothing definite. You understand, merely discussions about how to ensure the estate's continued viability." Crispin was always protective of family traditions, but he was also practical about financial realities. Our interview with Jenkins proved equally illuminating. The elderly valet entered with his characteristic military bearing, though I sensed an undercurrent of emotion beneath his professional demeanor. "Jenkins," Poirot began, "you served Sir Crispin his final dinner. How did he seem to you that evening?" "Rather agitated, sir, if I may say so." Sir Crispin was normally a gentleman of regular habits and calm disposition. That evening, however, he seemed expectant, nervous perhaps. In what way did this manifest itself? He asked repeatedly about visitors, sir, whether anyone had called, whether any messages had arrived. When I assured him there had been none, he seemed unconvinced. He also inquired about the household's evening routines, who would be about the grounds, that sort of thing. "Most curious. And your own movements that evening?" "I served dinner at 8, cleared away at 9:15, then secured the house as usual. I retired to my quarters at 9. Jenkins hesitated momentarily. "I should mention, sir, that as I was locking the front door, I observed Mrs. Grimsby returning from her walk. She appeared somewhat distressed." Dr. Thorne's account provided yet another piece of the evening's puzzle. The historian seemed eager to share his observations, his scholarly excitement overriding any discomfort about the tragic circumstances. "I was in my study until quite late that evening," he explained, settling his spectacles more firmly on his nose. "I'd been researching some particularly fascinating medieval manuscripts regarding the Grey Lady legend. Around 9:45, I decided to take a brief walk to clear my head, and during this walk, I made my way toward the tower, thinking to observe the battlements in the moonlight purely for atmospheric research purposes, you understand. As I approached, I witnessed the most extraordinary sight." Poirot leaned forward with interest. "Please continue." A grey figure was moving along the tower's upper level, clearly visible against the pale stones. The movement was fluid, almost floating exactly as the legend describes. I watched for perhaps 5 minutes before the figure disappeared. "The time, you are certain of it?" "Quite certain. The church bells had just struck 10 o'clock when I first observed the apparition. As our interviews concluded and we retired to our rooms for the evening, I found myself thoroughly bewildered by the various accounts. The timeline seemed clear enough, yet something about the whole business struck me as distinctly wrong." However, appeared thoughtful rather than confused. He stood by our sitting-room window, gazing out toward the dark silhouette of the bloody tower against the evening sky. "Most interesting, Hastings. We have here multiple witnesses to our Grey Lady, each observing her at slightly different times, and we have a victim who expected unwelcome visitors, a brother nervous about business affairs, and a household where everyone seems to walk alone in the darkness." He turned from the window, his grey eyes holding that peculiar gleam I had learned to associate with the stirrings of understanding. "Tomorrow we shall delve deeper into these mysteries. For tonight, I think it would be wise to keep our windows secured and our ears alert. The Grey Lady, she may walk again." Chapter 5, The Missing Dagger. Chapter 5, The Missing Dagger. The morning of our third day at Grimswood Grange dawned grey and blustery, with autumn winds rattling the ancient window panes and sending leaves scurrying across the estate grounds. I found Poirot already engaged in his morning correspondence, his precise handwriting covering several sheets of cream-coloured paper. "Ah, Hastings," he greeted me without looking up from his writing. "I have been making certain inquiries regarding our late Sir Crispin's business affairs. Most illuminating, I think you will find." Business affairs. I helped myself to breakfast from the sideboard, noting that the household had maintained its excellent standards despite the recent tragedy. "Surely you don't suspect this is some sort of commercial crime?" "Patience, my friend. All will become clear. But first, we must examine this famous dagger that delivered the fatal blow. The weapon. She will tell us much about the murderer's method and planning." An hour later, we made our way to the estate's private museum, housed in what had once been the Elizabethan wing of the main house. The collection occupied several rooms on the ground floor, displaying centuries of Grimsby family artifacts with a careful attention to detail that spoke of scholarly curation. Mrs. Penelope Whitmore, the museum's curator, met us at the entrance with evident nervousness. She was a small, bird-like woman of perhaps 55, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun and spectacles that seemed perpetually askew. Her hands fluttered constantly as she spoke, betraying an anxiety that appeared to run deeper than mere concern over the recent tragedy. "Oh, Mr. Poirot," she gasped. "I do hope you can make some sense of this dreadful business. I've worked here for 15 years, and nothing like this has ever happened, nothing remotely similar." "Madame Whitmore," Poirot replied with his customary courtesy, "you discovered the dagger's disappearance on the morning following the murder. I understand." "Yes, exactly so. I arrived at my usual time, 8 o'clock, sharp, to open the museum for Dr. Thorne's morning research session. When I went to dust the medieval weaponry display, I immediately noticed the gap where the Grimsby ceremonial dagger should have been." She led us through a series of well-appointed rooms filled with family portraits, ancient documents under glass, and carefully labelled artifacts spanning several centuries. The medieval weaponry occupied a substantial display case. In the third room, its contents arranged with museum-quality precision. Here, Mrs. Whitmore indicated a velvet-lined space between a battle-axe and a morning star. The dagger was displayed point downward, handle uppermost, exactly as you see with the other pieces. It's a 15th-century piece, probably Italian workmanship, with an elaborately carved bone handle and Toledo steel blade. Poole examined the display case with his characteristic thoroughness, paying particular attention to the lock mechanism and the arrangement of the remaining weapons. I noticed that several other pieces appeared equally deadly and historically significant. "This case it is secured each evening." "Oh yes, religiously. I lock it myself before departing, and Dr. Thorne has specific instructions about security. The family is quite protective of their historical artifacts." "And who possesses keys to this case?" Mrs. Whitmore's hands fluttered more nervously. "All the family members, of course, and Dr. Thorne, myself, and Jenkins. We occasionally have visiting scholars who require access, so several keys are necessary." "When did you last observe the dagger in its proper place?" 3 days before the murder, when I conducted my weekly inventory. Everything was perfectly in order." Then she paused, adjusting her spectacles with trembling fingers. "I should mention that the case showed no signs of forced entry. Whoever took the dagger used a key." Poirot's examination revealed subtle but significant details that had escaped the local police. He pointed out slight scratches on the velvet lining where the dagger had rested, suggesting it had been removed with considerable care rather than haste. "Most interesting," he murmured. "This theft, it was planned with precision, not committed in a moment of passion. Someone wished to acquire this specific weapon well in advance of using it." As we concluded our examination of the museum, Nigel Grimsby appeared, looking even more haggard than the previous day. His clothes, while still well tailored, showed signs of careless dressing, and I noticed his hands had developed a persistent tremor. "Mr. Poirot," he began, without preamble, "I've discovered something in Crispin's study that I think you should see. Letters, rather unpleasant ones." He led us to Sir Crispin's private study, a masculine sanctuary lined with leather-bound volumes and dominated by a massive mahogany desk. The room still carried the faint aroma of pipe tobacco, lending it an almost ghostly atmosphere of its former occupant. "I was going through Crispin's correspondence," Nigel explained. producing a small bundle of letters tied with black ribbon. "These arrived over the past several weeks, rather threatening in tone. I'm afraid the letters, written in an educated hand on common stationery, made for disturbing reading. They accused Sir Crispin of betraying the working classes, condemned his capitalist exploitation, and made increasingly specific threats about retribution for your crimes against the people." "Good Lord," I exclaimed, after reading the first few. "These are from some sort of radical agitator. Sounds like one of those socialist troublemakers who've been stirring up unrest in the industrial towns." "That's what I thought, Hastings," Nigel agreed eagerly. "Crispin had been receiving pressure about some of his business investments. There are people who object to his involvement with certain manufacturing concerns." Poirot, however, seemed less convinced by this apparent revelation. He examined the letters with his magnifying glass, paying particular attention to the handwriting and paper quality. "These threats, they are serious indeed," he acknowledged. "But observe, mon ami, the hand that wrote them is educated, controlled, not the script of a violent revolutionary." I think, while I remained convinced we were dealing with an outside agitator, Poirot's attention turned to other matters. He spent considerable time examining Sir Crispin's financial records, his sharp eyes scanning columns of figures and investment documents with methodical precision. "The estate's financial situation," he inquired of Nigel. "It is as precarious as these documents suggest." Nigel's face flushed deeply. "Rather worse than I'd hoped, actually. Crispin had been exploring various options for maintaining our solvency, some of them quite drastic, such as the possibility of selling portions of the estate, or even." Nigel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "He'd been approached by industrial developers interested in the entire property." This revelation struck me like a physical blow. The thought of Grimswood Grange, with its centuries of history and tradition, being sold to factory builders seemed almost sacrilegious. Our investigation took an unexpected turn when Dr. Thorne joined us in the study, carrying a slim volume bound in dark leather. "I've just recalled something that might prove significant," he announced, his scholarly excitement evident. "This book, Legends and Lore of the Yorkshire Grimsby's. I lent it to someone in the household just last week. Given the recent supernatural manifestations, I thought you might find it relevant." Poirot accepted the volume with evident interest. Immediately, opening it to examine the contents, the pages were filled with detailed accounts of family legends, historical events, and folklore spanning several centuries. I noticed that many passages had been underlined in pencil, and there were marginal notes in what appeared to be different handwriting from Dr. Thorne's scholarly script. "Most instructive," Poirot murmured, studying the annotations with particular attention. "These notes, Doctor, they are not yours." "Oh no, definitely not my hand. Whoever borrowed the book was clearly taking detailed notes about the Grey Lady legend and the tower's architectural features. Quite thorough research, actually. And to whom did you lend this volume?" Dr. Thorne's brow furrowed with concentration. "I'm afraid I can't recall exactly. It was someone from the household, that much I remember clearly. But which specific person?" He shook his head apologetically. "My memory for such details isn't what it once was." As we returned to our rooms that evening, I found myself more confused than ever by the multiplying complexities of the case. The threatening letters seemed to point clearly toward an outside enemy, yet Poirot appeared more interested in internal family matters and borrowed books. "I say, Poirot," I ventured, as we settled into our sitting room, "surely those threatening letters provide a clear motive. Some radical agitator bent on revenge against capitalist exploitation." My friend regarded me with that peculiar expression I had learned to associate with his moments of greatest certainty. "Mon ami, the letters, they are certainly threatening. But ask yourself this: why would a revolutionary from the industrial towns choose to murder Sir Crispin in a locked tower using a medieval dagger while dressed as the family ghost? Such drama, such elaborate staging, it speaks not of political conviction, but of something far more personal." Chapter Vi. Secrets of the Grey Lady. 6 Secrets of the Grey Lady. I confess that by our 4th morning at Grimswood Grange, I had grown increasingly exasperated with Poirot's seemingly oblique approach to the investigation. While I remained convinced that we were dealing with either supernatural forces or external enemies, those threatening letters seemed clear enough evidence. My friend appeared determined to pursue the most minute and seemingly irrelevant details of household routine. "Pooh," I said over breakfast, unable to contain my frustration any longer. Surely we should be focusing on those revolutionary letters, or investigating the supernatural manifestations. The local police have clearly been baffled by the ghostly elements. Ah, mon ami, he replied, delicately spreading marmalade on his toast with characteristic precision. You wish Poirot to chase the ghosts, n'est-ce pas? Very well. Today we shall indeed investigate these supernatural phenomena most thoroughly. To my surprise, Poirot's first suggestion was that we visit the village to speak with local residents about the Grey Lady legend. I had expected him to dismiss such folklore as mere superstition, but instead he seemed genuinely interested in gathering testimonials from the villagers. The village of Grimswood lay perhaps 2 miles from the collection of stone cottages clustered around an ancient church and a single coaching inn. The inhabitants received us with the mixture of curiosity and reserve typical of Yorkshire folk. Though Poirot's reputation had evidently preceded him at the Swan and Crown, we encountered Mrs. Martha Fielding, the innkeeper's wife, a stout woman of middle years with sharp eyes and an evident relish for dramatic storytelling. Aye, the Grey Ladies walked those battlements for centuries, she declared with evident satisfaction, setting down pints of ale before us with firm authority. My grandmother saw her twice in her lifetime, and my mother once during the terrible winter of 1847. Most interesting, Madame Poirot encouraged her with unusual attentiveness. And the recent sightings, can you describe exactly what the witnesses observed? Clear as daylight, according to those who saw her tall figure in flowing grey, moving along the tower's upper level like she was floating rather than walking. Always appears when tragedy befalls the Grimsby family. She does. The cloth was distinctly grey. Oh aye, grey as a Yorkshire sky. Some say it's a shroud, others reckon it's one of them old-fashioned gowns, but always grey, always flowing in the wind. We encountered similar accounts from several other villagers, each adding their own embellishments to the legend. What struck me as significant was the consistency of certain details, the grey colouring, the flowing movement, the location near the battlements. Yet Poirot seemed more interested in the precise timing and specific descriptions than in the supernatural implications. Old Tom Bradshaw, the village's senior resident at 83 years, proved particularly informative. Seen her myself, I did just 3 nights past. Was walking back from my daughter's cottage when I spotted the figure clear as anything against the pale stone. Moved like mist. She did, but purposeful, like the time you remember it precisely. Just past 10 o'clock it was. Church bells had finished striking when I first noticed her. Upon our return to the estate, I discovered Poirot examining Sir Crispin's study with renewed intensity, particularly his business correspondence and financial records. Among the papers scattered across the mahogany desk, I noticed several documents that made me pause with growing alarm. Good heavens, Poirot, I exclaimed, scanning a particularly fishy-looking contract. Look at this. Preliminary agreements for the sale of Grimswood Grange to Hartwell Industrial Enterprises dated just last month. Poirot examined the documents with his characteristic thoroughness. Most illuminating. Hastings. It appears Sir Crispin was indeed exploring drastic solutions to the estate's financial difficulties. When Nigel joined us an hour later, I could not contain my shock at this discovery. His reaction was immediate and devastating. The colour drained from his face so completely that I feared he might collapse. Sale agreements, he whispered, sinking into the nearest chair, as if his legs could no longer support him. Crispin was negotiating to sell Grimswood Grange without telling me. I'm afraid the documents seem quite conclusive, I said gently, though I felt rather brutal delivering such news. Preliminary negotiations with industrial developers. The proposed sale price is substantial, but it means the end of everything, Nigel finished, his voice hollow with despair. 21 generations of Grimsbys, and it would all disappear into factories, smokestacks, and workers' tenements. The revelation seemed to age him before our eyes. His hands shook uncontrollably as he struggled to light a cigarette, and I noticed his usually immaculate appearance had become increasingly disheveled. Crispin never mentioned any of this to you? Poirot inquired with gentle persistence. Nothing. He spoke of financial pressures, of difficult decisions that might be necessary. I never imagined. Nigel's voice broke slightly. This estate has been our family's heritage for centuries. The thought of it being destroyed for industrial development, it's unthinkable. Our conversation was interrupted by the entrance of Seraphina, who moved, with her characteristic ethereal grace, despite the shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. She paused in the doorway, taking in the scene with evident concern. "Nigel, you look dreadful. What's happened?" When we explained the discovery of the sale negotiations, her reaction surprised me. Rather than the shock I expected, she displayed a resigned sadness that suggested the news was not entirely unexpected. "I suspected something of the sort," she admitted, settling gracefully into a chair near the window. Crispin had been increasingly distant these past months, spending hours locked away with business correspondence. When I asked about his concerns, he would only say that difficult decisions lay ahead. "You were not happy in your marriage?" Madame Poole asked with his characteristic directness. Seraphina's composure faltered slightly. "Happiness is perhaps too much to expect from any marriage. Mr. Poole Crispin was a good man in his way, but we had grown distant. He was consumed by financial worries and family obligations, while I felt increasingly like a ghost, myself haunting these halls with no real purpose. Hence your evening walks. They provided my only peace to move freely through the grounds, to breathe the night air without the weight of expectations and disappointments. It was my sole escape from the suffocating atmosphere of duty and decline." As the afternoon progressed, the full scope of the family's crisis became clear. The estate's financial situation was indeed dire, with mounting debts and declining income forcing consideration of measures that would have been unthinkable to previous generations. The conflict between preserving family heritage and accepting modern financial realities had apparently driven Sir Crispin to desperate considerations. Yet throughout these revelations, Poirot maintained his methodical approach, asking precise questions about timing, details, and circumstances that seemed peripheral to the main tragedy. I found his focus on such minutiae increasingly maddening. When faced with the dramatic elements of the case, that, as evening approached, we gathered in the drawing-room, where the family's portraits seemed to gaze down with accumulated disapproval at the current generation's failures. The weight of tradition and expectation felt almost tangible in the gathering dusk. 21 generations, Nigel repeated softly, staring up at the painted faces of his ancestors, and I would have been the one to see it all destroyed. The autumn wind picked up outside, rattling the ancient windows and sending shadows dancing across the room. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the church bells marking the evening hour, their bronze voices carrying across the Yorkshire landscape as they had for centuries past. Chapter 7. The Trap in the Tower. Chapter 7. The Trap in the Tower. The fifth evening of our stay at Grimswood Grange brought with it an atmosphere of almost palpable tension. The household had grown increasingly unsettled as the investigation progressed, and I noticed that conversations tended to halt abruptly when Poirot or I entered a room. Even the normally unflappable Jenkins seemed nervous, his usually precise movements betraying an underlying anxiety. It was Dr. Thorne who brought us the startling news that was to transform our understanding of the case entirely. "Mr. Poirot," he called, hurrying into the library where we had been reviewing the annotated volume of Grimsby Legends, "the most extraordinary thing has occurred. The Grey Lady has appeared again." I felt a distinct chill run down my spine at this announcement. Again? When? Where? Just now, not 10 minutes past. I was in my study when I heard Mrs. Whitmore cry out from the museum. She had been working late, cataloguing some recent acquisitions, when she observed the figure gliding past the windows that faced toward the tower. We followed Dr. Thorne to the museum wing, where we found Mrs. Whitmore in a state of considerable distress. The poor woman was pale as parchment, her hands trembling so violently that she could barely hold her cup of tea. "Oh, Mr. Poirot," she gasped. It was the most terrifying sight. I was arranging the medieval manuscripts when movement outside caught my eye. There, clear as daylight against the tower stones, was the Grey Lady herself. "You observed this apparition clearly, madame?" "Perfectly clearly. A tall figure in flowing grey garments, moving along the battlements with that characteristic floating motion. It lasted perhaps 3 or 4 minutes before disappearing entirely." Seraphina and Nigel had also witnessed the manifestation from different vantage points in the house. Their accounts corroborated Mrs. Whitmore's description in every particular: the grey clothing, the ethereal movement, the location near the tower's upper level. "This settles the matter," I declared to Poirot once we had gathered all the testimony. "We're clearly dealing with genuine supernatural phenomena. The Grey Lady has returned to claim vengeance for some ancient wrong." To my amazement, Poirot's response was not the skeptical dismissal I expected. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully and announced a plan that struck me as absolute madness. Tiara's been, Hastings. If the Grey Lady wishes to manifest herself, then Hercule Poirot shall give her the opportunity to do so properly. Tonight, I shall spend the evening in the Bloody Tower. Perhaps this ghost and we can have a little conversation. N'est-ce pas peur? I exclaimed in horror. You can't possibly be serious. The tower is clearly haunted, and after what happened to Sir Crispin, because of what happened to Sir Crispin, my friend, the truth, she hides in that tower, and tonight Poirot will discover what it is. The entire household erupted in protests when Poirot announced his intention. Nigel declared it was far too dangerous. Seraphina begged him to reconsider, and even the stoic Jenkins expressed concerns about the wisdom of such an undertaking. Mr. Poirot, Dr. Thorne said earnestly, I've studied the Grey Lady legend for 20 years. She appears only when tragedy threatens the family. To deliberately court her attention might be inviting disaster. But Poirot remained immovable in his decision. The investigation, it has reached a point where direct action is required. Tonight, all will be revealed. Despite my vehement protests and offers to accompany him, Poirot insisted on entering the tower alone. The Grey Lady, she is shy, I think. Too many observers, and she will not appear. But Poirot by himself, that is different. As darkness fell, I watched with growing anxiety as my friend made his preparations. He equipped himself with a small electric torch, his magnifying glass, and that peculiar assortment of items he always carried for his investigations. Most unusually, he also took a small vial of what appeared to be powder and several sheets of white paper. What on earth are those for? I inquired, but he merely smiled mysteriously and tapped the side of his nose. The sight of Poirot walking across the moonlit grounds toward the Bloody Tower was one I shall never forget. His small, precise figure appeared almost absurdly vulnerable against the backdrop of the ancient stone structure. Yet he moved with characteristic confidence and purpose. I positioned myself at the library window, which provided the best view of the tower, determined to maintain watch throughout the night. The other members of the household had retired, though I suspected none would sleep peacefully with Poirot conducting his mysterious vigil. For the first hour, nothing occurred. The tower stood silent and dark against the star-filled sky, betraying no sign of either ghostly or human activity. I found myself growing drowsy despite my anxiety. The warmth of the library fire and the comfortable chair conspiring against my vigilance. It was shortly past 11 o'clock when I heard the first sound, distant cry that seemed to echo from the direction of the tower. My blood ran cold as I strained to identify the source, but the night had fallen silent again. Then, perhaps 20 minutes later, came a second cry, more distinct and unmistakably human. It was followed by what sounded like a struggle, sounds of conflict that carried across the still air with terrifying clarity. I could bear the suspense no longer. Seizing a torch from the library desk, I rushed from the house and hurried across the grounds toward the tower. My heart pounded with dread as I imagined what I might discover, perhaps Poirot fallen victim to whatever malevolent force had claimed Sir Crispin. The tower door stood open, which I took as an ominous sign. I called out as I approached, but received no immediate response. Inside, my torch beam revealed nothing unusual in the circular chamber where Sir Crispin had met his fate. Poirot, I called again, my voice echoing hollowly in the stone space. Hastings, came his familiar voice from above, most punctual as always. Please join me on the battlements carefully. The stairs are treacherous in the darkness. I found him standing calmly on the tower's upper level, apparently examining something in the pale moonlight. To my relief, he appeared entirely unharmed, though his usually immaculate appearance showed signs of activity. His jacket was slightly askew, and there were traces of dust on his trousers. Good Lord, Poirot, I exclaimed. I heard sounds of struggle. What happened? My friend, the Grey Lady and I, we have indeed had our meeting. Most illuminating it was, though perhaps not in the way our witnesses might expect. He held up a small piece of fabric that gleamed pale in the moonlight. Observe this fragment. Hastings caught upon a stone projection during our little encounter. And regard this. He gestured toward his magnifying glass, which lay open beside a white sheet of paper. Most interesting traces for our chemical analysis. Chemical analysis? What are you talking about? The perfume, Mon Ami, very modern scent and quite distinctive. Not the sort of fragrance one expects from a 16th-century ghost, I think. I stared at him in bewilderment. Are you saying the Grey Lady is not supernatural? The Grey Lady, she is certainly not supernatural, but she is very real indeed, and very much connected to the murder of Sir Crispin. Come, let us examine these architectural features that have proved so illuminating. He led me to a section of the battlement wall that appeared identical to the rest, but under his guidance, I could see subtle differences, worn spots in the stone, scratches that suggested frequent use, and what looked like a concealed mechanism. As we made our way back to the house, Poirot's manner suggested the satisfaction of a man who had finally grasped the solution to a complex puzzle. The pieces of fabric and the mysterious chemical traces he had collected seemed to have provided the final evidence he required. The autumn wind had picked up during our adventure, sending clouds scudding across the moon and creating shifting shadows that danced across the ancient grounds. Yet I felt that the real shadows, those of mystery and deception that had shrouded Grimswood Grange, were finally beginning to lift under the methodical illumination of Poirot's investigation. Chapter 8. The Truth Behind the Grey Lady. Chapter 8. The Truth Behind the Grey Lady. The following evening found us gathered in the library of Grimswood Grange, for what I had come to recognize as one of Poirot's theatrical revelations. The entire household was present, Nigel and Seraphina seated near the fireplace, Dr. Thorne in his usual chair surrounded by scholarly volumes, Jenkins standing at respectful attention by the door, and Mrs. Whitmore perched nervously on the edge of a chair. Poirot had arranged himself before the assembled company with his customary precision, his hands clasped behind his back and his grey eyes holding that peculiar gleam I had learned to associate with moments of triumph. Mes amis, he began in his most formal manner, we have here a mystery that appears to defy rational explanation. A man murdered in a locked tower, supernatural apparitions witnessed by multiple observers, and a crime that seems to bear all the hallmarks of ghostly vengeance. But I tell you now that there are no ghosts in this affair, only human hearts, driven by very earthly passions. I observed the faces around me, noting the mixture of anticipation and anxiety that Poirot's words invariably produced. Nigel appeared particularly haggard, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his cigarette case. Let us begin with the locked room mystery that so baffled the local police, Poirot continued. A tower secured from within, high windows impossible to negotiate, and apparently no other means of entrance or exit. Yet someone entered that tower, committed murder, and departed without leaving a trace. How was this accomplished? He moved to the fireplace, his small figure commanding attention through sheer force of personality. The answer, mes amis, lies in the tower's medieval construction. During my vigil last evening, I discovered what the builders of 1380 intended, to remain hidden, a secret passage connecting the tower to the main house, accessible through a concealed mechanism in the battlement wall. Dr. Thorne leaned forward with scholarly excitement. A secret passage, but I've studied the tower's architecture for 20 years. Precisely, Doctor, because you studied it as a historian, not as a detective. The passage entrance is cunningly concealed within what appears to be ordinary stonework, but the mechanism bears signs of recent use, scratches on the stone, worn spots where hands have gripped, traces of modern dust and fabric. Poirot produced the piece of grey material he had collected the previous evening. This fragment, caught upon a stone projection during my encounter with our Grey Lady, will prove most significant, for you see, the supernatural manifestations that have terrified this household were carefully orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of both the family legends and the estate's hidden architectural features. Seraphina's face had grown pale as winter moonlight. You're suggesting someone deliberately created the ghost sightings? Mais oui, madame. Someone who knew that the Grey Lady legend would provide perfect cover for a carefully planned murder. Someone who could arrange for witnesses to observe the apparition at precisely the right moment, to establish an alibi and create confusion about the crime's supernatural nature. I found myself completely absorbed by Poirot's reconstruction, though I confessed the solution remained beyond my grasp. But the Grey Lady was seen by multiple witnesses, I protested. Mrs. Whitmore, Dr. Thorne, even villagers in the town. Indeed, Hastings, and that is the key to understanding our murderer's method. The sightings were real, but the figure was not supernatural. Someone wearing a flowing grey garment appeared on the battlements at carefully calculated times, creating the illusion of ghostly activity while providing cover for the real purpose. Poirot's gaze settled on Seraphina, with gentle but inexorable certainty. "Madame Grimsby, you mentioned wearing your grey cashmere shawl during your evening walks, a beautiful garment, and one that would appear quite spectral when viewed from a distance in moonlight." Seraphina's composure began to crumble. "I don't understand what you're suggesting." "I suggest that someone asked you to walk the battlements on the night of the murder, perhaps as a romantic gesture or a whimsical surprise for your husband. You obligingly donned your grey shawl and provided the ghostly sighting that multiple witnesses observed." The truth was beginning to dawn on me with horrifying clarity. "You mean she was an unwitting accomplice?" "Precisely. While Madame provided the supernatural distraction, the real murderer used the secret passage to enter the tower, kill Sir Crispin with the stolen dagger, and escape unseen. The locked room mystery was merely clever staging. Nigel had gone chalk white, his cigarette forgotten and burning down between trembling fingers. This is all speculation. Mr. Poirot, you have no proof." "Ah, but I do, monsieur. First, the annotated volume that Dr. Thorne lent to someone in the household. The marginal notes reveal detailed study of the Grey Lady legend and, most significantly, historical references to the tower's secret passage. The handwriting, when compared to your personal correspondence, proves most revealing." Dr. Thorne stared at Nigel with dawning comprehension. "You borrowed my book, but why didn't you simply ask about the family legends directly?" "Because," Poirot answered, "he needed to research the details without arousing suspicion. Second, we have the evidence of my chemical analysis. The perfume traces I collected from the tower were not medieval fragrance, but a modern scent-specific, the eau de cologne that Monsieur favors." Nigel's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Circumstantial evidence, nothing more." "Perhaps, but then we have the physical proof." Poirot moved closer to where Nigel sat frozen in his chair. "Your gold cufflink, monsieur, the left one, bears traces of a very specific type of limestone dust, found only in the passage connecting the tower to the main house. Dust that would accumulate on clothing during passage through that confined space." I watched in fascination as Nigel's defenses finally crumbled completely. His shoulders sagged, and the cigarette fell from his nerveless fingers to the carpet. "The motive," Poirot continued, relentlessly, "was not greed or hatred, but love of family heritage, twisted into destructive obsession. When you discovered your brother's plan to sell Grimswood Grange to industrial developers, you could not bear the thought of 21 generations of family history being destroyed. In your mind, murdering Crispin was the only way to preserve what you held sacred. He was going to destroy everything," Nigel whispered, his voice breaking. "Centuries of family heritage sold to factory builders for the sake of mere money. I couldn't let that happen." "So you planned the perfect crime," Poirot said with gentle sadness. "You stole the ceremonial dagger, researched the family legends to create your supernatural cover, and persuaded your sister-in-law to provide the ghostly distraction. You used the secret passage known only to Grimsbys to enter the locked tower, killed your brother, and escaped unseen. The Grey Lady sightings ensured that everyone would focus on supernatural explanations rather than human ones." The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Jenkins stepped forward quietly to stand behind Nigel's chair, his military bearing evident as he prepared to assist with whatever unpleasant duties lay ahead. "I wanted to preserve our heritage," Nigel said finally, his voice hollow with despair. "Instead, I destroyed it more completely than any industrial development ever could." As the local police were summoned and the grim formalities began, I found myself reflecting on the tragic irony of the case. In seeking to preserve his family's honor through murder, Nigel had instead brought upon the Grimsby name a scandal that would echo through history long after any factory development might have been forgotten. The ancient stones of Grimswood Grange had witnessed many secrets over the centuries, but perhaps none more poignant than this tale of love transformed into betrayal and heritage, preserved through its own destruction. Thanks for joining us for the murder of Crispin Grimsby. If you enjoyed this atmospheric mystery with Hercule Poirot featuring haunted towers, family secrets, and the tragic consequences of preserving heritage at any cost, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, this is Ali signing off from Cafe Tales.